The waste chute smelled like burnt metal and old oil, and nobody ever checked it twice. That was why Owen Hale almost missed the sound. He was cutting through the lower docking corridor of Talvin Station after a double shift, boots heavy on the grated floor, when he heard it. Not a hiss, not a pipe leak, something smaller, something wet and ragged and barely there. He stopped. He was a doctor. 12 years of field medicine across 4 frontier postings had trained him to stop when something sounded wrong, even when his body was begging him to keep walking. He crouched beside the chute grate. Behind the mesh, curled against the cold alloy wall, was the most pitiful creature he had ever seen. It was small enough to fit in both his hands with room to spare. Scaled, winged, and dark as charcoal, a draconi hatchling. Its chest moved in tiny, unsteady pulls. One of its wings was folded wrong. Its eyes were shut. Owen sat there for a moment. He knew what this was. He had been on Talvin Station for 8 months now, long enough to understand draconi customs better than he wanted to. The clutch from the imperial breeding vessel docked in Bay 9 had hatched 3 days ago. Word had spread through the station the way gossip always did. 5 strong hatchlings, the noble line secured, the family honored. 6 had hatched, he knew that now. He pulled the grate open and reached in without thinking too hard about it. The hatchling fit in his palms like something that had already decided to give up. Its body was cold. Not cool, cold, in the way that meant the internal fire that draconi were born with had not lit properly, if it had lit at all. Owen stood up and put the hatchling inside his jacket against his chest. The walk to the medical bay was 4 minutes. He used all 4 of them arguing with himself and lost the argument before he arrived. Administrator Price was waiting in the corridor outside, the way Price always seemed to be waiting wherever he was least convenient. The man had the sharp face of someone who had spent years calculating risk and very little time taking any. Dr. Hale, Price looked at the slight movement under Owen's jacket. His expression did not change, which meant he already knew. Tell me you did not. I found a living creature in a waste chute. You found a draconi discard. There is a difference recognized by imperial law, 3 trade agreements, and common sense. Owen pulled his jacket open slightly. The hatchling's small head tilted toward the warmth. Price closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. If the breeders file a complaint, this station loses its landing rights. Do you understand what that means for 800 people? I understand what it means for 1, Owen said, and kept walking. The medical bay was designed for humans, with 1 small section retrofitted for basic alien triage when the treaty was signed. Owen laid the hatchling on the padded triage surface under the heat lamp and started pulling equipment without ceremony. His hands moved through the familiar routine of assessment while his mind ran ahead, calculating the gaps. He had no draconi-specific medication. He had no precise knowledge of their internal anatomy beyond what the treaty's medical annexes contained, which was approximately 3 pages of generalities written by someone who had clearly never treated one. What he had was a patient. The hatchling's temperature was critically low. Its breathing was shallow and irregular. The metabolic markers Owen could read from a basic bioscan were all wrong, not in ways that matched any human emergency he recognized, but wrong in the same fundamental sense, the sense of a body running out of time to decide whether to keep going. Owen set up a heat wrap, adjusted to the highest safe setting. He ran a secondary scan, slower this time, building a picture. Then he sat back and looked at the creature for a moment. It was ugly in the way that all newborns are ugly, all proportion and need, nothing finished. The dark scales were dull, not the deep metallic gleam he had seen on adult draconi. The wings were too large for the body, crumpled at the edges. Its claws were barely formed. But its chest was still moving. Owen opened his kit and got to work. He did not have a name for it yet. He was not sure it would survive long enough to need one. But when he pressed 2 fingers to the side of its neck and felt the pulse, thin, erratic, stubborn, he made a quiet decision that this creature had already done something remarkable. It had stayed alive long enough to be found. Outside in the bay corridor, He could hear the distant footsteps of someone walking fast, probably from the Draconi vessel, probably not happy. Owen did not look up from his patient. The Draconi enforcer filled the doorway the way a boulder fills a gap in a wall, completely, and with the quiet suggestion that the wall had never existed. His name was Rask. He wore the dark grey band of an imperial keeper, the rank responsible for overseeing hatchling transfers and, when necessary, cullings. He was roughly 2 meters tall, his scales the deep copper brown of old armor, and he looked at Owen the way someone looks at a child who has knocked over something irreplaceable. "You took property of the Draconi Imperium from a designated disposal site," Rask said. His translator collar kept his voice flat and even, which somehow made it worse. Owen was at the workbench with his back half-turned, drawing a small measured amount of a human electrolyte compound into a syringe so thin it looked like it might break. "I took a living patient from a waste chute. There's a difference." The hatchling was assessed and found insufficient. "The culling is tradition and law." "Your law," Owen turned around. "On this station, in this medical bay, within the designated human operational zone, as established by Article 14 of the Talvan Accords, I hold medical authority. If you want to challenge that, I'll get Administrator Price." Rask's nostrils flared slightly. He had clearly already spoken to Price, and Price had clearly already cited Article 14, because Rask did not move further into the room. He stood in the doorway with the expression of someone who had found an unexpected wall and was deciding how much he wanted to break it. "You have 3 days," Rask said. "If the creature does not demonstrate viable survival function by the 3rd morning, it is returned to us. If it does survive," he paused, as if the sentence offended him, "then we discuss further." He left. The doorway felt larger without him. Owen exhaled and turned back to the hatchling. 3 days. He had stabilized the temperature with the heat wrap. The pulse was slightly stronger, but the bioscan kept returning one number that didn't sit right, a protein compound in the blood that registered at nearly 0. In humans, a compound like that missing from the bloodstream meant the body couldn't process certain nutrients correctly, couldn't build the right cellular structures. He had no way to know if it worked the same way in Draconi. But the hatchling wasn't eating because it couldn't, and a creature that couldn't eat was a creature on a countdown. Owen pulled up every page of the medical annex from the Talvan Accords. 3 pages, as he remembered. He read them 4 times. He cross-referenced with 2 xenobiology papers published 6 years ago by a researcher on a station 3 systems away, neither of which had been written by a doctor, both of which were mostly theoretical. He took what he could use and built from it. On the first night, he synthesized a nutrient compound by modifying a human amino acid supplement, reduced concentration, adjusted mineral ratios based on the known Draconi mineral density documented in the annex. He administered it in tiny amounts through the thin syringe, watching the hatchling's reaction with the attention of a man who knew he had no room for a second attempt. No reaction, not bad, not good. He tried again 4 hours later. On the 3rd dose, the hatchling's tongue moved. It was a small thing, a reflex, but Owen wrote it down anyway. On the 2nd day, the hatchling opened its eyes for 30 seconds and then closed them again. The eyes were pale gold, the color of something that hadn't quite decided what it was yet. Owen noted the time and went back to adjusting the compound. He slept in the chair next to the triage table in 2-hour stretches. He ate what was in his kit bag. He stopped checking the corridor to see if Rask was watching, because it didn't matter and because the answer was always yes. By the morning of the 3rd day, Owen had a problem. The hatchling was improving slowly, unevenly, but improving. The pulse had steadied. The temperature was holding. The protein compound in the blood was rising. But the bioscan had flagged something new, a structural irregularity in the secondary lung tissue. In a healthy hatchling, the internal fire, the biological combustion organ that all Draconi possessed, would have ignited within hours of birth, warming the body from the inside and triggering a cascade of developmental responses. This hatchlings had not ignited. Without it, the compound Owen was feeding, it could only do so much. The body needed the ignition to complete the next stage. He had no way to trigger it from the outside. No drug, no tool, no protocol. He sat with that for a long time. Then he thought about what the organ actually needed. Heat. A specific, localized, sustained heat applied at the correct point on the chest wall. He had looked at the anatomy long enough to have a rough idea where. He had a surgical laser designed for human procedures, calibrated for tissue depth in humans. He spent 40 minutes recalibrating it. Then he sat down across from the hatchling, rested his elbows on the table, and looked at it. "I'm going to try something," he said quietly. "I don't know if it will work, but I think you'd rather I try." The hatchling's pale gold eyes opened and looked back at him. Owen picked up the laser. The procedure took 11 minutes. Owen worked with the laser set at the lowest continuous setting, applying heat in slow, careful passes across a point 3 centimeters below the hatchling's sternum, in the hollow where the chest plate scales had not yet fully hardened. He kept one hand on the bioscan feed and one on the instrument. The hatchling did not move. It watched him with those pale gold eyes and breathed in the thin, unsteady rhythm that had become familiar over 3 days. At minute 8, nothing had changed. At minute 9, Owen's hand was steady and his jaw was tight. At minute 11, the bioscan spiked. It was a sharp, clean spike, the kind that meant something had changed all at once rather than gradually. Owen pulled the laser back and looked at the hatchling. For a moment it was completely still. Then a tremor ran through its whole body, small and fast, like a shiver from the inside out. The temperature reading on the bioscan climbed, not from the heat wrap, but from the hatchling itself. The internal fire had ignited. Owen set the laser down on the tray with great care. He sat back in his chair. He breathed out slowly and looked at the ceiling for exactly 5 seconds, which was all he allowed himself. Then he leaned forward and checked everything. The temperature was rising evenly. The protein compound in the blood was climbing faster now, the body using it the way it was supposed to now that the ignition was active. The pulse had shifted from thin and erratic to thin and steady. The secondary lung tissue was expanding properly. The hatchling's eyes were bright. Owen reached out and put 2 fingers against the top of its head, the same way he had done with the pulse check on the first night, because it was the only gesture he had that meant anything. The hatchling pressed back against his fingers with a strength that surprised him. "There you go," he said. Rask appeared in the doorway at exactly the 3rd morning mark. He had 2 other keepers behind him, and he carried a small sealed container, the kind used for transport. His expression was set for a predetermined outcome. Owen stepped aside and let him look at the bioscan display. Rask looked at it for a long time. He looked at the hatchling. The hatchling looked back at him with gold eyes and absolutely no fear, which seemed to unsettle him more than the bioscan did. "This is," Rask stopped. He tried again. "The ignition response should not be triggerable through external means." "Apparently it is," Owen said. "With enough patience and the right application of sustained heat at the correct depth. I wrote up the full method. You can take a copy." Rask did not take the copy. He stood in the doorway for another long moment. Then he turned and walked away without another word. The 2 keepers followed him. The container stayed behind on the floor, forgotten or perhaps deliberately left. Owen was not sure which. He picked it up, put it in the storage cabinet, and went back to his patient. In the days that followed, the hatchling ate for the first time. Not from a syringe, it ate from Owen's hand, tiny scraps of the synthesized nutrient compound he had reshaped into something denser and easier to manage. The first time it bit one of his fingers instead of the food, Owen counted it as progress. It grew slowly at first, then faster, the way young things grow when they finally have what they need. The dull charcoal scales began to catch the light differently. The crumpled wings straightened, the claws hardened properly. Owen had started calling it dust, after the color it had been on the first night, dark and scattered and easy to miss. The name stuck in the way that names do when they are given in the early hours of something difficult. He never thought of it as a formal name. He thought of it as a fact. Word traveled. Stations are small worlds, and small worlds have no secrets. Within a week, everyone on Talvin Station knew that the human doctor had saved a draconi-culled hatchling. Within 2 weeks, the story had reached the trading vessels that passed through. Within a month, Owen received a formal inquiry from a draconi research scholar 3 systems away asking for his bioscan records and the full write-up of the ignition procedure. He sent it. 3 months after that, a message arrived from the imperial court. It was brief and carried no warmth. It informed Owen that a senior delegation would be visiting Talvin Station to review the situation regarding the hatchling known as Dust and to determine the appropriate course of action under imperial law. Price delivered the message in person. He stood in the medical bay doorway looking at Dust, who was now large enough to take up the entire triage table and was watching Price with calm, unsettling attention. "They're sending Vesa," Price said. He said the name the way people say the name of a weather system. "Should that mean something to me?" Owen asked. "It means," Price said carefully, "that this has reached a level where they're deciding whether you're an incident or a precedent." He paused. "I'd prefer you be an incident." Owen looked at Dust. Dust looked back at him. The gold eyes were clearer now, brighter, and something behind them had begun to look like understanding. "I don't think that's our choice anymore," Owen said. 9 months after the night in the waste chute, Dust had outgrown the medical bay. She had moved into the storage annex next door, which Owen had quietly cleared of equipment crates and lined with the thermal padding originally ordered for emergency habitat use. She was still small by draconi standards, roughly the size of a large horse now, which would have seemed enormous until you understood that a healthy hatchling at this age should have been considerably larger. Her siblings, by the reports Owen had quietly obtained, were already twice her size. But Dust was fast, and Dust was paying attention to everything. She had learned to recognize Owen's keycard sound before he rounded the corner. She had learned that the bioscan device was not threatening. She had learned that if she rested her head near the speaker on Owen's desk, the audio files he played from medical databases made sounds that seemed to interest her deeply, even though she could not yet understand them. Owen had started annotating his audio files with draconi translation overlays. He was not sure when that had become a deliberate project rather than an idle habit. Vesa arrived on a Tuesday, which the draconi did not observe as a day of any significance, but which Owen always remembered afterward. She came with a small party, 2 advisors, 1 recorder, no keepers. That was the first unexpected detail. The second was that she was older than Owen had anticipated. He had pictured someone like Rask, hard, official, certain. Vesa was none of those things outwardly. She was silver-scaled, which among draconi indicated advanced age, and she moved with the careful economy of someone who had learned not to waste motion on things that did not matter. She stood in the annex doorway and looked at Dust for a long time without speaking. Dust looked back, then Dust looked at Owen. Then Dust looked at Vesa again and made a sound, low and resonant, somewhere between a question and a greeting. It was the first intentional vocalization she had directed at anyone other than Owen. Something shifted in Vesa's expression. It was small. Owen might have missed it if he had not been watching closely. The formal review took place in the station's conference room. Owen sat across the table from Vesa and her 2 advisors. Price sat at the end. Visibly hopping, nothing would require him to speak. The recorder documented everything. Vesa's questions were precise and methodical. She asked about the ignition procedure, the nutrient compound, the timeline of Dust's development. Owen answered all of it, the same way he had answered Rask's challenge on the 3rd morning, plainly, with records to support every point. Then Vesa asked a question that was not on the formal list. "Why did you do it?" she said, not as an accusation, as a genuine inquiry. Owen considered the question. "Because she was alive, that's enough reason. Among your people, perhaps. Among ours, the matter is not so simple. The culling exists Because the Imperium requires strength. A weak line weakens everything that depends on it. Weakness isn't the same as a slow start, Owen said. I've worked in field medicine for 12 years. Most of the best outcomes I've seen came from patients who looked like they had no chance in the first few hours. Biology is not a verdict, it's a condition. Vesa was quiet for a moment, and if she had died despite your intervention, then I would have done everything I could for a patient who deserved a chance. He paused. She didn't die. Vesa looked down at the records on the table. She turned pages, physical copies, which the Draconi still preferred for formal review, and read in silence. That afternoon, she asked to spend time with Dust alone. Owen agreed and waited in the corridor, which was long enough to give him time to reconsider whether agreeing had been a good idea. He heard no distress sounds. After 40 minutes, Vesa came out with a piece of information she had not arrived with. She attempted to communicate, Vesa said. She used basic imperial sound signs, 2 of them, correctly. Owen kept his expression neutral. He had been teaching Dust those sound signs for 6 weeks using the annotated audio files. He had not mentioned this to anyone. She learns quickly. Vesa looked at him for a moment. No, she learns the way the strong ones do. That is not what I expected. She folded her hands in front of her. I will make no recommendation for removal, but I will be making a full report to the Imperial Court. You should understand that this situation will not remain a station-level matter. I know, Owen said. The court has not decided whether you are a problem yet. I know that too. Vesa looked at the door to the annex. She chose her own name when I asked for it. In the sound signs, she paused. Draconi hatchlings do not name themselves for months, sometimes longer. Owen said nothing. What did you do, Doctor, in that room with her for 9 months? He thought about the long shifts, and the audio files, and the bioscan routines, and the careful meals, and the small, persistent effort of treating someone like they were worth treating. I just showed up every day, he said. Vesa left the station the next morning. She did not say goodbye, but when the shuttle lifted from the docking bay, it made a slow pass over the station's observation dome before it jumped, which was not standard flight protocol. Owen watched it go. In the annex behind him, Dust made the low resonant sound again, the one that sat between a question and a greeting. He went back inside. 4 years later, the Draconi Imperium was dying by degrees, and nobody could explain why. It started in the outer fleet, 3 cruiser crews reporting the same cluster of symptoms. Fatigue so heavy that Draconi warriors, beings who could go days without sleep, were collapsing during duty shifts, scales losing their metallic sheen, internal temperature dropping, and a failure of the fire, not all at once, but slowly, the biological combustion that kept every Draconi alive, guttering like a lamp running out of fuel. They called it the grey settling because that was what it looked like, the color draining out, the fire going quiet. Within 6 months, it had spread to 14 ships and 2 colony stations. Within 8 months, Draconi healers, the Menders, had tried every tool in their tradition and failed to slow it. The Menders worked from a knowledge base built over centuries of treating the strong, the battle-scarred, the structurally whole. They knew how to set broken bones the size of support struts. They knew how to treat scale-deep burns and tearing wounds. They did not know how to treat a body failing from the inside. That was the province of the weak. The Imperium had never studied it. The message came to Talvin Station on a morning when Owen was doing routine checkups on the station's crew. The message was flagged with the gold band priority code he had never seen used in 4 years of frontier posting. It was from Vesa. She was brief, as always, the grey settling, the fleet, the failure of the Menders, and then, at the end, you treated a failure of internal fire in a hatchling with no formal draconic medical training. We require your knowledge now. Bring whoever you trust. Owen looked up from his desk. Dust was across the room, cross-legged on the thermal pad she still used despite now being large enough that her wings touched both walls when she stretched. She was reading, an actual reading habit now, built over 4 years of shared audio files and Owen's deliberate choice to always work out loud, narrating his medical reasoning as he went. She looked up before he said anything. He showed her the message. She read it twice, which she did with everything complex. Then she looked at him with eyes that had darkened over the years from pale gold to a deep amber, the color of something that had fully decided what it was. "I know the fire," she said. Her standard was precise now, built from years of listening and practice. "I know what it feels like when it almost goes out." "You were 3 days old," Owen said. "I remember the cold," she said simply, "and I remember when it stopped." They left within the hour. The imperial medical vessel they were taken to was larger than the entire Talvin station. Owen felt small in every corridor. The menders who met them were clearly uncertain how to behave, a human doctor and an undersized draconi who walked beside him like a colleague rather than behind him like a subject. There was a period of tense formality before a mender named Orvath, old, copper-scaled, and clearly exhausted, simply handed Owen a bioscan of an affected patient and said, "Tell me what you see." Owen saw it in 40 seconds. The protein compound, the same one that had registered at nearly zero in dust on the first night. Not the same cause, but the same collapse, the body losing the building block that fed the combustion organ, so the fire dimmed and the whole system followed. The grey settling was not a plague in the infectious sense. It was a cascade failure triggered by an environmental factor in specific fleet zones, a mineral compound in the recycled water supply of older vessels, slowly depleting the one thing the Draconi body needed most to keep its fire. Owen explained it in plain terms. The menders listened, some of them argued. Orvath told them to stop arguing. Dust, standing at the bioscan display, had already begun mapping the spread pattern against the ship's water recycling maintenance logs by the time Owen finished talking. "Here," she said, pointing, "and here, same maintenance cycles, same filters, same depletion rate." The room was very quiet. Owen built the treatment protocol in 3 days, working with Orvath and 2 junior menders who had stopped being uncertain and started being genuinely useful. The compound was synthesized from materials the fleet already carried in medical supply. The treatment was not dramatic. It was 2 doses over 4 days and a change to the water filtration. Within a week of the first treatments, the affected crews were improving. Within 3 weeks, the protocol had been distributed across the fleet. Orvath found Owen sitting alone in a small observation room on the 4th week, watching the stars the way people watch them when they have a lot of thoughts that don't have words yet. 7,000, Orvath said. He sat down across from Owen, which took some arrangement given the difference in their sizes. "Rough count, 7,000 soldiers and crew who will live because you knew what a failing fire looks like." "Just knew," Owen said. "I just knew the chemistry." "She knew because you gave her the chance to know." Orvath was quiet for a moment. "The menders have practiced medicine for 400 years. We have never treated a failure of internal systems because our tradition holds that such failures are natural selections. We let them happen." His voice carried something Owen had not heard from a Draconi before, something that sounded like shame. "We have been very foolish." "You were working from what you had," Owen said. "Yes," Orvath agreed. "And you worked from something else." Owen looked at the stars. "What's that?" Orvath considered the question, with the care of someone choosing the exact right word. "The assumption," he said at last, "that saving a life is always worth the attempt." The imperial court had not changed a formal law in 63 years. It changed one that winter. The culling rite, the tradition by which weak or undersized hatchlings were discarded at birth, was struck from the imperial code in a session that lasted less than an hour. The vote was not close. 7,000 recovered soldiers and crew were difficult to argue against, and Orvath, who had been a mender for 40 years and carried the kind of authority that comes from outliving every critic, made certain nobody tried. The announcement was broadcast across the fleet on all channels simultaneously, which was reserved for events of imperial significance. Vesa, who had traveled back to the capital for the session, sent Owen a message that contained exactly 4 words: "It has been done." Owen read it twice, then put his communicator down on the desk in Dust's room, her room now, a proper space on the Imperial medical vessel, because they had not gone back to Talvin Station yet. There was more work to do. The Menders were building a new division, one focused on internal medicine, on the quiet failures that happened below the surface where strength could not help. They had asked Owen to help design the training structure. He had said yes. Dust was at the window when he looked up. She spent a lot of time at windows now. She was thinking, usually, in the long, complex way she thought, following threads that took time and space to develop. She was still smaller than any Draconi her age on the vessel. She had stopped growing at roughly 2/3 the expected adult size, and no treatment Owen had developed could change the structural reality of how she had started. She did not seem to mind, or rather, she had decided not to let it determine anything. "They'll tell it wrong," she said, without turning from the window. "What do you mean?" "The story. In 100 years, they'll say a great Draconi warrior overcame weakness to save the Empire." She glanced back at him. The amber eyes held something wry in them. "They won't mention the human doctor who stayed up for 3 days in a medical bay built for the wrong species." "That's fine," Owen said. "It's not accurate. Most important things get told wrong eventually. The fact that it happened is the part that matters." Dust turned back to the window. A long moment passed. "I want to go home," she said. Owen understood that she did not mean the Imperial vessel or the capital world. She meant Talvin Station, the corridor where he had found her, the medical bay, the storage annex with the thermal padding, the place where the important thing had happened. They went back in spring. The ceremony that the Imperium insisted on holding at Talvin Station was something Owen had tried to avoid and failed. Vesa stood on a platform in the docking bay with half the station's population watching and a delegation of Imperial officials behind her, and she read aloud the formal declaration establishing Dust as Warden of the Talvin Frontier. A new title, one that had not existed before, created for the purpose of marking the boundary between the Draconi Imperium and human space as a zone of permanent cooperation rather than cautious tolerance. Owen stood beside Dust during the reading, which was protocol. He was listed in the declaration as her chosen advisor and medical partner, which was not standard protocol but was Dust's doing. She had insisted. Rask was in the crowd. He stood near the back, which he did not have to do. His rank entitled him to the front. He watched the whole ceremony without expression. When it was over and the crowd moved, Owen found himself standing near him for a moment. "The container," Owen said, "the one you left behind on the 3rd morning." Rask did not answer immediately. "It was an oversight," he said at last. "Of course," Owen said. They did not say anything else, but as Rask turned to leave, he made a short motion with his right hand, a small, flat gesture that Owen had come to recognize after 4 years of Draconi contact. It was the sign used between soldiers of equal standing when words were insufficient. Owen stood there for a moment after Rask walked away. The generations that came after did not tell the story wrong entirely. They got some details wrong, as generations always do. They made Dust larger in the retellings, fully grown, powerful, unmistakable. They made the medical bay brighter and the crisis more dramatic than 3 quiet days of compound adjustments and a surgical laser recalibrated at a workbench. They added things that were not there. But the core of it held. In the hatchling halls, where young Draconi were raised under the new code, teachers told the story as a lesson about what strength actually meant. Not size, not fire, not birth order or immediate function. The will to keep breathing, the choice to help something keep breathing even when no protocol required it. And always, in every version of the story, in the Imperial archives and the station records and the hatchling halls alike, one fact remained unchanged and was never edited out. A human doctor had found the smallest, coldest, most discarded creature in a waste chute on the edge of Draconi space. And he had stayed. The Empire never forgot that.